After I'd written Roman warfare with its very broad sweep, it's looking at all of Roman history, all of Roman warfare over the best part of 1,000 years, I was asked by my publisher to write a book on the Punic Wars. Now, I'd been doing some research on that during my time as a junior research fellow at Cardiff. I'd been particularly looking at the military aspects, how the army worked. In some ways, I was starting a book that would have been like the doctoral thesis on how the army worked, but looking at the army of the 3rd, 2nd century BC. It's a book that I've never got around to writing and might one day, but I think many of the ideas have already come out in the Punic Wars. Now, for those who haven't realised, the Punic Wars was subsequently reissued as The Fall of Carthage in paperback. It's exactly the same book apart from that title. Wasn't my decision, it's the sort of thing publishers do. But not to confuse people, there are 2 separate books. It is the same thing, just with a different title. But this was different again to writing Roman warfare, because I was looking at, again, a narrower topic. Although when you think the 3 Punic Wars do span the best part of a century. So it's still broad, but the First Punic War is grand in scale, but not very well documented. The Second Punic War, we have far greater sources, predominantly Livy and Polybius, but supported by others. The Third Punic War only lasts 3 years. The others last a couple of decades each, cause huge loss of life, devastation on a wide scale. The Third Punic War sees a much weakened Carthage destroyed by a vengeful Roman Republic. So it's trying to tell that story and put each conflict in its context and in the context of what we know about each society. To some extent, this is like going back to the Roman army at war and the more traditional detailed study. However, again, it's a question of audience. As I've said before, I'm writing this book and every other book for anyone who's got sufficient interest to pick it up, who wants to know more about Hannibal or the Punic Wars. Hannibal tends to be the big thing. A lot of people with even casual interest in history, let alone military history, will have heard of Hannibal. They might have heard of the Battle of Cannae. So it's trying to explain what we know, what really happened, admit what we don't know. That's a fundamental principle I've applied in all my books, that where the sources don't make clear what happened, and that's quite often with a lot of topics in the ancient world, that you actually say, we don't know. This is the evidence, this is how far we take it, this is what I think might be going on, but it's only a thought, it's only a guess. This is not a certainty that, yes, this is definitely how things worked out, because there are so many gaps in the information we have for almost any aspect of the ancient world. So this one's a big story, but it was written, again, for the general reader. And in fact, I remember having a meeting with my editor at the time. The first time when I started writing it, the first draft, the first chapter, I went back very much into my sort of academic mould, and I had a long discussion of all the existing literature on the subject. And I remember my editor telling me quite frankly, look, Adrian, nobody knows who these people are. You're just complicating the issue. So deal with these ideas, but don't just lay it out, so-and-so said this, then Badian came along. That's true. Most ordinary people are not going to know the names of scholars. They're not going to be familiar with the debates about the nature of the Roman army, the nature of the Roman economy, the scale of damage inflicted by Hannibal's armies, the way the armies were raised and worked, the background of Carthaginian society. So you can put all these ideas in, but the existing literature, the way you can follow it up, that's all relegated to endnotes at the back of the book. 99% of the readers, probably more, will never bother to look at those. But if you do want to know, if you do want to follow the path, the logic I followed, the research I did, and go further, it's all there. Everything is there for you to find. You'll probably need an academic library for access to a lot of this stuff, but it's all there. So it means that you can get on with introducing the ideas. You don't have to simplify or dumb down in any way. You just have to explain. And the point with books like this is they are all about communication. It's trying to help your reader understand these big ideas, these big debates, without weighing them down with vast quantities of information before you even get started. So the First Punic War is a fascinating struggle, but really, apart from Polybius' moderately detailed account in his Universal History, where it's really there as background to what follows later. He is not covering this in the same sort of depth that he covers the Second Punic War and originally covered the Third Punic War, even though that's only survived in fragments. So you have the story of Rome's intervention in Sicily, the Carthaginian response, feeling that this was very much the Romans poking their nose into an area that was under Carthage's sphere of influence, if not necessarily control. And the reaction, first of all in a land war, how the Roman army starts to learn to fight abroad. It's never been outside Italy before. And then the development of the Roman navy. The First Punic War is very much a struggle dominated by sea power, largely because it focuses around Sicily and Sicily as an island. And neither of the sides, the Carthaginians or the Romans, are physically joined to Sicily. So they have to get there by sea, even though they do, Carthaginians from the start and the Romans eventually have territory, have allies on the island. Still, everything that comes from home has to get there over water. And there's this wonderful story of the Romans taking apart a wrecked Carthaginian vessel and basically analysing it and copying it, building their own fleet, and then managing to defeat the Carthaginians in the first of a succession of naval battles. And it is striking that of all the big naval clashes on any scale in the First Punic War, the Carthaginians only managed to win one of them. So although they're very much a maritime power, they've got a strong seafaring tradition, and they have a very large fleet at the start of the war, it clearly doesn't give them a certainty of victory at any stage. And perhaps they've become a little stale. Perhaps the fact that they haven't had to fight against another major sea power for a long time means that they're not really ready. They've become complacent, they've become stale. So that's a very interesting struggle, but in the end, it's a key feature in this. The Romans win because they keep on going. When the Carthaginians lose their last fleet, there isn't the commitment in the state to build another one, they just negotiate and give in. The Romans keep on building more ships, they keep on finding more crews, more armies from somewhere, and they keep on fighting. They do not give in. Now, the Second Punic War will be provoked because the Carthaginians feel ill-treated in the aftermath of the first. The second is the famous one. It's the War of Hannibal, it's his elephants over the Alps, it's his cataclysmic defeat of the Romans at Cannae, where something like 50,000 Roman and allied soldiers are killed within one day and within a few square miles. Slaughter on an appalling scale, rare until the Great War. And all done by hand. It's not done by artillery, it's not done at a distance. This is all done by muscle-powered weapons. Most states would have given in at that point, the Romans do not. And the story is of Hannibal outclassing the Romans in the early years, and for most of the time he spends in Italy, but not being able to convince the Roman Republic to negotiate, accept defeat, and accept peace terms in which the Romans admit that, yes, we've lost, you're now the dominant power. He was not fighting to destroy the Roman Republic, so he claimed. He was fighting for honour and for power. And he probably didn't have the capacity to destroy the Roman state. Now, how far he appreciated that the Roman Republic was something very different, that it was something far bigger with far deeper roots. Because although he tries to split away Rome's allies and has some success in southern Italy, it really is quite striking how little success he actually achieves in this. And once an Italian community defects to the Romans, it's very hard for Hannibal to protect all of them. And the Romans are extraordinarily vicious and vengeful in their reprisals. So it's a story of the Romans enduring, and it's also a story of the Romans learning. A whole generation of men like Scipio Africanus grow up fighting Hannibal, and they spend far more time with the army than was normal for a Roman aristocrat before this conflict. And as a result, they become very good because they're learning in a really tough school. Facing up to Hannibal and the Carthaginians is difficult. These are good armies, dangerous opponents, skillful generals, particularly Hannibal. His brothers and other Carthaginian leaders have rather less success, but that's partly because over time they're coming up against better and better Roman armies, more and more skillful Roman leaders. So eventually the war will be won. This is the story of the main part of the book. The Third Punic War is a much shorter episode, and it's provoked famously by the elder Cato saying, Delenda est Carthago, Carthage ought to be destroyed, holding up figs that are still fresh even though they've come from North Africa, pointing out just how close the Carthaginians are to Sicily and to Italy itself, and they're an enemy, why should we trust them? If we just let them grow stronger, they will eventually want their revenge, because that's what any normal proud people would want. And the Romans destroy Carthage. Doesn't go terribly well for them in the first few years, and that's been a pattern of warfare in the middle part of the 2nd century BC. The generation that had won the war against Hannibal and then fought the wars of the first few decades of the 2nd century BC has grown too old to serve. They're basically elderly, they've died, they've moved on. They haven't been able to pass on a lot of their military experience to the next generation, and there's a complacency, a sense that we're Romans, therefore we'll win. We don't need to think too much about the practicalities of it. So even though it's the lesser war, even though it's one-sided, even though the Romans can't really lose the Third Punic War, this is still an interesting conflict. So the point of that book, and it's an early one, it's over 20 years old now, was very much to tell that story in as much detail as was possible.